Chapter 18 of American History Stories, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. American History Stories, Volume 2, by Laura L. Pratt. Chapter 18. The March to Quebec. In 1775, the Americans began looking longingly towards Canada. Ever since the success at Ticonderoga, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had been saying, "Send us to Montreal and Quebec. Let us take them as we took Crown Point and Ticonderoga." Washington knew what a grand thing it would be for the American army to get possession of these cities, but he also knew something which very few beside himself knew, and that was that the American army had not enough powder to carry on their work where they were much longer unless help came. For this reason he held back some time. Many officers and soldiers heaped abuse upon Washington's head for this, and nearly accused him of being cowardly. He endured their blame, however, for he dared not let it be known how low the powder supply was growing. Finally, in the early fall, two armies were ordered into Canada, one under General Montgomery, the other under Benedict Arnold. General Montgomery led his division up through New York and down the St. Lawrence to Montreal, while Benedict Arnold led his division up through Maine. Montgomery's soldiers were a wretched-looking set, ragged and dirty, shoeless and hatless, but still willing to march on and fight for their loved country. On reaching Montreal, they found that the British soldiers had been all called into the colonies, and that the city was therefore without defense. Of course, the city was taken with little or no trouble, and in the army marched. It is a terrible thing to ransack a city as this army ransacked Montreal, but as long as wars go on, these things must be done. And since it has to be done here, we cannot but be glad that it was our own brave men who fell upon the riches of this city. Such treasures as they did find! Not so much money, but food and clothing, blankets and warm shirts, jackets and trousers, stockings and shoes. They thought it almost worth while to have marched all this distance just to be once more warmed and clothed and fed. They remembered, too, the other soldiers who were coming up through Maine and would soon be with them, and they carried off enough of all these good things for them as well. Montgomery, leaving a part of his soldiers to hold Montreal, now marched on to Quebec, where Arnold was to join forces with him. When Arnold came, he had a terrible story to tell. Their march up through Maine had been almost as terrible as the winter at Valley Forge, of which you will read later on. The army had come up the Kennebec River in boats, and when they had come to places where they could not push along their boats, they had carried them on their backs until open places again were found. It had been so bitterly cold. They had marched waist deep through icy water, and had lain down in their wet clothing night after night in the freezing forests. Their clothes, ragged enough when they set out, could now hardly be kept together. Their shoes, in this 500-mile march, had been worn to nothing, and many a soldier had frozen his feet. Their provisions, too, had given out, and many of the soldiers had eaten the leather of their shoes and knapsacks, so hungry were they. Many of these poor men, overcome by starvation and sickness, had turned back discouraged. Some of them afterward succeeded in getting back to Massachusetts, but more died lost in the forests. Arnold had with him a brave young man named Aaron Burr, who acted the part of a hero in this terrible march, and in the attack that followed. When Montreal was reached, Burr started on another 100 miles to tell Montgomery that Arnold's forces were ready to join him in the attack on Quebec. It was now December, the last day of the year. A severe snowstorm was raging, a real blizzard we should call it now, and in the very midst of it, the command came for the attack upon Quebec. Now there were very few soldiers in the city, and it would have been a very easy thing to take this city, as easy as it had been to take Montreal, only that this city was a walled city, and more than that, it was situated high up on bluffs or cliffs overlooking the river. You can see how hard it was for the army outside to get up to this city, and how easy it was for the army within the city to sweep them down with their fire. A terrible, almost hand-to-hand battle followed. One battery had been taken by the Americans, and they were just attacking the second. "Follow me, my brave boys," called Montgomery, "and Quebec is ours." But just then down came a volley of grape shot from the garrison above, striking dead this brave leader and mowing down the soldiers on every side of him. Dismayed at the loss of their leader, the men in the rear turned and fled, and Quebec was lost to our side. When young Aaron Burr, who was standing beside Montgomery in the foremost ranks, saw his leader wounded, he caught up the falling body, and staggering under the load, dragged it down the bluffs beyond the reach of the fire of the enemy. Arnold remained for some time in Canada, hoping to find a chance to attack the city again. But the soldiers in the city were on the watch, and before very long British soldiers arrived to help them. Then there seemed nothing for him to do but to march home with the broken army, and so to leave Canada to the British. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of American History Stories, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. American History Stories, Volume 2, by Laura L. Pratt. Chapter 19. Washington and His Army. Now that the war had really begun, events followed upon each other thick and fast. Before the summer was over, every colony, from New Hampshire to Georgia, was up in arms. Washington had gathered his army outside of Boston, and there he held General Gage imprisoned in the city. Washington had now several good generals to help him, one of whom, called Old Put, was famed far and wide for his pluck. In another chapter you will read about Old Put's wolfhound, a story you must know, for although it is not exactly a story of the Revolution, still it does no harm to know any story of the heroes of the Revolution that tells of the daring courage of these men. But we were speaking of Washington's army. In A History of Our Country, written by Abby Sage Richardson, is the following excellent description of the appearance of the colonial army. You can form no idea what a task lay before Washington and his generals. Here was a great body of men hurried into the field from farms and workshops, with no more idea of military drill than a herd of sheep, with miserable old muskets, scanty supply of powder and balls, and no money to buy any. Then the dress of this provincial army was enough to excite the laugh which the British soldiers raised at them. Some of them were dressed in the long-tailed linsey-woolsey coats and linsey-woolsey breeches, which had been spun and woven in farmhouse kitchens. Some wore smock frocks like a butcher, also made of homespun. Some wore suits of British broadcloth, so long used for Sunday clothes that they had grown rather the worse for the wear, and every variety of dress and fashion figured in these motley ranks. When General Washington rode grandly out on horseback, dressed in his fine blue broadcloth coat, with buff-colored facings, buff waistcoat and breeches, a hat with black cockade, and a sword in an elegantly embroidered sword-belt, I think his heart must have sunk within him as he looked at his tatterdemalion army, and then glanced over towards Boston, and thought of the British soldiers, gorgeous in their elegant new uniforms, trained to march up to the cannon's mouth like a solid wall in motion. But for all that, Washington knew that his army was brave, and in dead earnest, for were they not fighting for their own homes, their own mothers and wives and children? Two brothers in Washington's army, to show what skillful marksmen they were, took a board only 5 inches wide and 7 inches long, fastened a piece of white paper the size of $1 upon it in the middle, and then shot at it at a distance of 60 yards. 8 bullets they fired, and every one of them went straight through the white paper. When the lookers-on wondered at them, they said, "There are 50 more men in our company who can do just as well." They then offered to shoot apples off each other's heads, as William Tell is said to have done long, long ago. But their commander said that they had shown their comrades that they could, beyond a doubt, send a bullet straight through the heart of a British soldier, and that now they had better save their powder till a British soldier appeared. And so you see that although these men were so oddly dressed, and although they knew so little of military training, yet they had clear heads and straight eyes, and above all, dauntless courage. End of chapter 19.